Brave rescue team saves black shepherd dog from giant eagle attack eagle dog. That old dog is as good as dead. The eagle's already got him. There's nothing you can do. Every life is worth saving, Sheriff, and I'm not leaving that mountain without him. The fierce wind whipped around them as Margaret Wilson, head of the Mountain Valley rescue team, stood at the edge of Eagle Cliff, binoculars trained on the distant ledge where a massive golden eagle had cornered a black shepherd dog. The terrified animal was backed against the rock face, its leg clearly injured, while the enormous bird, wingspan easily 6 feet, shrieked and lunged repeatedly, talons extended. Sheriff Dale Pritchard shook his head, his weathered face etched with concern. "Margaret, that's a 100-foot drop if you slip. That bird's protecting its nest and it won't back down. I've seen what those talons can do." "Then you'd better radio for backup," Margaret replied, already unloading her climbing gear from the rescue truck. Her silver hair was pulled back in a practical braid, her movements efficient despite her 62 years. "That's Richard Keller's dog, Shadow, been missing 3 days now. Richard served 2 tours in Vietnam. I'm not telling a veteran we abandoned his best friend." The sheriff's radio crackled with urgent updates about the gathering storm. "You've got 30 minutes before this weather turns deadly," he warned. Margaret secured her climbing harness and glanced up at the darkening sky, then down to where her team waited young Jason with his medical kit and veteran Tom with the backup ropes. They were her family now, had been for years since her husband passed. She'd trained them both, but this would push everyone to their limits. "Shadow's still fighting," she said, adjusting her red bandana, the same one she'd worn on rescue since 1978. "So we will too." But as Margaret prepared to descend, a massive gust of wind hit the cliff face. The eagle screeched, spreading its enormous wings as Shadow lost his footing and tumbled from the narrow ledge, disappearing from view as his panicked howl echoed across the valley. "No!" Margaret lunged forward, the sheriff barely catching her before she could follow the dog over the edge. "He's gone, Margaret," Sheriff Pritchard said grimly. Nobody could survive that fall, but Margaret's eyes narrowed as she stared down into the mist. "There's a smaller ledge 30 feet down. He might have landed there." She turned to her team, determination etched in every line of her face. "Jason, prep the medical kit for canine trauma. Tom, secure that second anchor point. We're not giving up." But let's go back to how this all started. It was just 3 hours earlier when Margaret Wilson was hanging up the last of her laundry, listening to Elvis on her old radio, the way she did every Tuesday morning. Margaret hummed along to "Can't Help Falling in Love" as she pinned the sheets to the clothesline behind her modest mountain cabin. At 62, she moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent decades relying on her own 2 hands. The morning sun filtered through the pines that surrounded her home, casting dappled shadows across the yard where she'd raised her children, now grown with families of their own. The phone rang inside, and Margaret sighed, wiping her hands on her jeans before hurrying to answer it. These days, calls usually meant trouble, especially when they came this early. "Wilson Residence," she answered, automatically glancing at the framed photo of her late husband Robert in his forest ranger uniform. He'd been gone 8 years now, but she still sometimes reached for the phone to tell him about her day. "Margaret, it's Richard Keller." The voice on the other end sounded strained. "Shadow's been missing since Sunday. I've looked everywhere I can manage with this bad hip. You know he never wanders." Margaret's heart sank. Richard was one of the few Vietnam veterans in Mountain Valley who'd stayed after the war, building a quiet life alone with his dogs after his wife passed away. Shadow, his black German shepherd, was more than a pet. He was Richard's constant companion, trained to help with everything from his mobility to the nightmares that still plagued him decades after the war. "I'll be right over, Richard. We'll find him." Within 20 minutes, Margaret had loaded her rescue gear into her 1985 Ford pickup, the same truck Robert had taught their son to drive in, and headed to Richard's small house at the edge of town. The Mountain Valley rescue team might officially be for people, but Margaret had never turned away from an animal in trouble. When she arrived, she found Richard on his porch, leaning heavily on his cane. At 75, his tall frame had grown thinner, but his military bearing remained. The worry in his eyes made him look older than she'd ever seen him. "I appreciate this," he said simply as she approached. "The sheriff's office said they couldn't spare anyone for a missing dog." "Well, I'm not the sheriff's office," Margaret replied with a gentle smile. She had known Richard since the day he'd moved to town in 75, back when people still whispered about those Vietnam boys, and Richard would flinch at the sound of car backfires on Main Street. As they talked, a blue Jeep pulled up, and Jason Chen hopped out, medical kit in hand. At 28, Jason was the newest and youngest member of Margaret's team, a paramedic who'd moved to Mountain Valley 2 years ago and quickly become indispensable. "Got your message," he called, jogging up to the porch. "Hey, Mr. Keller. You didn't have to call in the whole cavalry for me, Margaret," Richard said, looking embarrassed. "Jason was already on standby today," Margaret assured him. "Now, when exactly did you last see Shadow?" As Richard described Shadow's disappearance, Tom Sullivan's pickup truck rumbled into the driveway. At 54, Tom had been Margaret's right-hand man for over a decade, ever since she'd rescued him after a rock-climbing accident and he decided to pay it forward by joining her team. His expertise as a former park ranger made him invaluable. "Tom brought the tracking equipment," Margaret explained to Richard. "Now, do you have something with Shadow's scent?" Richard nodded and disappeared inside, returning with Shadow's worn plaid bed. "He's been sleeping on this for years." Margaret took it carefully. "Perfect. We'll find him, Richard, I promise." Within minutes, the team had begun their methodical search, starting with Richard's yard and gradually moving toward the forest that bordered his property. Tom operated the handheld tracker while Jason cataloged potential prints and signs. "He's a smart dog," Margaret said as they worked. "If he got injured, he'd try to find shelter." "Shadow did 2 tours with me in Nam," Richard said quietly, following as quickly as his bad hip would allow. "Used to scout ahead for trip wires, saved my whole unit more times than I can count." Margaret paused. "I didn't know you had him back then." Richard shook his head. "Not this Shadow, his grandfather. I've had 3 generations of them. Same bloodline, same name. This one's just as smart as his granddaddy was." By midday, they had traced Shadow's likely path into the national forest that covered most of Mountain Valley. The radio on Margaret's belt crackled to life. "Margaret, it's Sheriff Pritchard. We've got a storm system moving in faster than expected. You folks still out searching for Keller's dog?" Margaret stepped away to answer. "Affirmative. We're about 2 miles into the northwest quadrant. Any chance of getting some additional help?" There was a pause before the sheriff responded. "Negative. Got all hands dealing with a tour bus breakdown on Route 16. Besides, county resources are for people, not pets." Margaret bit back her frustration. Dale Pritchard was new to the job, having moved from Chicago just 5 years ago. He still didn't understand how things worked in a close-knit community like Mountain Valley. "Roger that, we'll manage." When she returned to the group, Tom was studying his topographical map with concern. "Margaret, these tracks are heading straight for Eagle territory. If Shadow wandered up there..." Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the darkening sky. Eagle Cliff was the most treacherous area in the region, named for the golden eagles that nested there. The birds were protected and territorial and large enough to see a medium-sized dog as either a threat or prey. Richard must have read the concern on their faces. "What is it? What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong yet," Margaret assured him. "But we need to pick up the pace. Richard, I think it's best if you head back to town. This terrain is going to get rough and that weather's moving in." Richard straightened, his jaw set. "With all due respect, Margaret, I've crawled through jungles with shrapnel in my leg. I'm coming." Margaret recognized the look in his eyes. She'd seen it in Roberts whenever anyone suggested he couldn't do something. "All right, but you stay with Jason. Tom and I will move ahead to cover more ground." As they pushed deeper into the forest, the terrain grew steadily more challenging. The pine needle floor gave way to rocky outcroppings and the incline steepened. Dark clouds gathered overhead, bringing with them the distinct smell of approaching rain. Tom paused suddenly, holding up his hand for silence. "Listen." In the distance, barely audible, came the sound of barking, desperate and afraid. "That's him," Richard called out. "That's Shadow." Margaret was already moving, picking her way across the rocks with the sure-footedness of someone who had spent a lifetime in these mountains. The barking grew louder, interspersed now with another sound, a high, piercing screech that sent birds scattering from the treetops. "Eagles," Tom confirmed grimly, hurrying to keep pace. They crested a ridge and stopped short. 100 yards ahead lay the beginning of Eagle Cliff, a series of sheer rock faces rising hundreds of feet from the valley floor. There, on a narrow ledge about halfway up, was Shadow. The black German shepherd was backed against the rock, one leg held awkwardly, clearly injured. Above him, circling with predatory focus, was one of the largest golden eagles Margaret had ever seen. As they watched, the eagle dove, causing Shadow to bark frantically and press himself flatter against the cliff face. "It's defending its nest," Tom said, pointing to a rocky outcropping just above where Shadow was trapped. "And it sees him as a threat." Richard started forward, but Jason gently held him back. "Mr. Keller, we can't just rush in. Those birds have a 6-foot wingspan and talons that can pierce skull." "So what do we do?" Richard demanded, his voice rising with urgency. "He's trapped up there." Margaret was already assessing the cliff face, mentally mapping the safest route up. Tom, radio the sheriff, tell him our position and that we're attempting an Eagle Zone rescue. Margaret. Tom's tone held warning. I know the risks, she cut him off. Jason, get the medical kit ready for a canine trauma assessment. Richard, I need you to stay here and keep visual contact. If Shadow moves or the situation changes, you tell Tom immediately. The authority in her voice left no room for argument. As Margaret and Tom quickly gathered the climbing equipment from their packs, the sky darkened further, and the first fat raindrops began to fall. Storm's moving in fast, Tom muttered, securing anchors for their ropes. Margaret nodded, pulling on her climbing gloves, the ones Robert had given her on their 20th anniversary, just a year before the cancer took him. Then we move faster. Within minutes, they had established their base, and Margaret began her ascent, moving with the careful precision that had saved dozens of lives over her years of rescue work. Tom remained at the anchor point, coordinating with Jason and Richard below. The rain fell harder now, making the rock face slick and treacherous. Halfway to Shadow's position, Margaret paused to catch her breath, the muscles in her arms burning with familiar exertion. Below, she could hear Tom's radio crackling with the sheriff's voice, though the words were lost to the growing wind. When she reached the ledge just below Shadow's position, the eagle spotted her and let out a piercing cry, abandoning its menacing of the dog to focus on this new intruder. Margaret pressed herself against the rock face as the massive bird swooped past, close enough that she could feel the wind from its wings. Easy now, she murmured, though whether to the eagle or herself she wasn't sure. Using a moment when the eagle circled higher, Margaret made the final climb to Shadow's ledge. The German shepherd whimpered as she approached, his intelligent eyes reflecting pain and fear, but recognition too. He knew what humans in rescue gear meant. Hey there, boy, Margaret said softly, reaching out slowly to let him catch her scent. Richard sent me to bring you home. Shadow limped toward her, his rear leg clearly injured but not broken. As Margaret quickly checked him over, the eagle screeched again, diving toward them with talons extended. Down, Margaret commanded, and Shadow flattened himself against the rock beside her as the eagle passed overhead, its talons grazing her backpack. The bird was more aggressive than she'd anticipated, likely with young in the nest above. Margaret reached into her pack and pulled out a rescue blanket, the sort of shiny, reflective emergency cover that she'd used countless times before. As the eagle banked for another pass, she unfurled it with a sharp snap, creating a sudden flash of reflected light that startled the bird momentarily. Using the distraction, Margaret quickly fashioned a secure harness for Shadow from the extra climbing straps in her pack. The dog remained surprisingly calm, as if understanding that cooperation was his best chance for survival. Tom, she called down, I've got him secured, ready the recovery line. But as Tom prepared to send up the secondary safety line, a massive gust of wind hit the cliff face, driven by the intensifying storm. The rock beneath Margaret's feet suddenly gave way, a section of the ledge crumbling after being weakened by the recent heavy rains. Shadow yelped in terror as he slid toward the edge. Margaret lunged for him, grabbing his harness with one hand while desperately clinging to her anchor with the other. For one heart-stopping moment, they both dangled precariously, Margaret's shoulders screaming with the strain of supporting both their weights. Hold on, Margaret, Tom shouted from below, already adjusting the ropes to compensate. With a supreme effort, Margaret pulled Shadow back onto what remained of the ledge, but the danger was far from over. The eagle, agitated by the commotion, was making increasingly aggressive passes, and the deteriorating ledge wouldn't support them for long. It was then that Margaret made a critical decision. Rather than attempt to descend with Shadow, a slow process that would leave them vulnerable to both the eagle's attacks and further rock slides, they needed to go up and over. Change of plans, she called down to Tom. We're going over the top. Tom's response was lost to a crack of thunder, but Margaret was already moving, securing Shadow to her back where he clung like a child might, his training evident in how perfectly he balanced his weight. With the dog secured, Margaret began the challenging ascent, finding handholds in the wet rock with practiced skill. The eagle continued to circle and dive, but with each attack, Margaret used the reflective blanket to confuse and deter it. The rain poured down now, plastering her silver hair to her face and making every movement treacherous. Yet she continued upward, drawing on decades of experience and the deep well of determination that had defined her life. From below, Richard watched with his heart in his throat as Margaret's figure grew smaller against the cliff face. The rain limited visibility, and at times he lost sight of her completely, only to spot her again, steadily making progress upward with Shadow secured to her back. It's going to make it, Jason said beside him, though his voice held more hope than certainty. The minutes stretched painfully as they watched the perilous climb. Finally, Margaret reached the top of the cliff, pulling herself and Shadow over the edge and out of sight. "She's over," Tom called from his position, relief evident in his voice. Richard exhaled, not realizing he'd been holding his breath, but their relief was short-lived. Above them, the eagle let out a furious screech and disappeared over the cliff top as well. "The nest must be up there," Jason said, worry creeping back into his voice. Tom was already speaking urgently into his radio, trying to reach Margaret, but the storm was interfering with the signal. All they could do was wait and hope. On top of the cliff, Margaret found herself face to face with exactly what she'd feared, the eagle's nest, containing two nearly fledged eaglets. The adult eagle had landed beside the nest, and now stood with wings partially spread in a threatening posture, its fierce eyes fixed on Margaret and Shadow. Shadow growled low in his throat, but remained still against Margaret's back, as if understanding that movement might provoke an attack. Margaret slowly reached for her emergency whistle, a tool she'd used before to deter predators with its high-pitched sound, unpleasant to many animals. But before she could bring it to her lips, a second adult eagle appeared, sweeping in from behind and forcing Margaret to duck as it passed overhead. "Two adults," she muttered. Of course there had to be two. She was now effectively trapped on the clifftop, with the eagles blocking her path to the forest and safety. The rain continued to pour, reducing visibility and making the rocky ground slippery. Margaret carefully unhooked Shadow from her back, keeping him close as she assessed their options. The safest route would be along the cliff edge to where it gradually sloped down to meet the forest, but that path took them directly past the nest, which wasn't an option with both parents in attack mode. The only other way was through a narrow passage between large boulders that might provide some protection from aerial attacks. "That way, Shadow," she said, pointing toward the passage. The dog seemed to understand, limping quickly beside her as they made their move. The eagles immediately responded, both launching into the air with piercing cries. Margaret used the reflective blanket again, waving it to create confusing patterns of light despite the dim conditions. It bought them just enough time to reach the passage, where the overhanging rocks provided partial shelter. They made their way through the tight space, Margaret constantly aware of the eagles crying outside. Shadow pressed close to her legs, his training apparent in how he matched her pace despite his injury. When they emerged on the other side, they found themselves on a gradually descending slope that led toward the forest line in safety. But between them and the trees was a stretch of open ground, perhaps 30 yards across, with no cover. The eagles circled overhead as if aware of the vulnerability their quarry would soon face. Margaret's radio crackled suddenly to life. "Margaret, do you copy? It's Sheriff Pritchard. I'm at your base position with your team." She quickly brought the radio to her lips. "Copy, Sheriff. I've got Shadow, but we're trapped on the clifftop with two adult eagles defending their nest. We need a distraction to reach the tree line." There was a pause before the sheriff responded. "Understood. We've got the eagle deterrent kit from the ranger station. Moving to your position now. Can you signal your location?" Margaret still had her flashlight, an old, reliable maglite that had been with her on every rescue since the early 80s. She pointed it toward where she knew the team would be climbing and clicked it in a pattern. 3 short flashes, 3 long, 3 short. SOS, an old code, but one everyone in Mountain Valley Rescue knew. "Signal received," came the sheriff's reply. "Stand by." Margaret and Shadow waited, huddled against the rock as the rain continued to fall. After what seemed like an eternity but was probably only minutes, Margaret's radio crackled again. "We're in position at the tree line, deploying deterrent on my mark. When the eagles respond, make your run for the northwest path. We've got cover set up." Margaret positioned herself and Shadow at the edge of their rocky shelter, ready to move. "Ready on your mark, Sheriff. 3, 2, 1, mark." From the edge of the forest came a series of loud, sharp sounds, ranger flares designed specifically to deter wildlife without causing harm. Simultaneously, several reflective sheets much larger than Margaret's were unfurled, creating a disorienting display of light even in the rainy conditions. The effect on the eagles was immediate. Both birds veered away from their patrol above Margaret and Shadow, flying toward this new, more significant threat to their territory. "Now," Margaret commanded, and together she and Shadow broke from cover, running as fast as they could across the open ground. Shadow's injury slowed them down, but the dog pushed through the pain, understanding the urgency of their situation. They were halfway to the tree line when one of the eagles broke off from the distraction, spotting their movement. It banked sharply, folding its wings to dive directly at them. "Down!" Margaret shouted, dropping to the ground and pulling Shadow protectively against her. The eagle passed just inches above them, its talons extended but finding no target. As the bird circled for another pass, Margaret and Shadow were up and running again. The tree line was so close now, perhaps 10 yards away. The sheriff and rescue team were visible, waving them in urgently. The eagle dove again. This time, Margaret didn't have a chance to duck. But just before it reached them, a final, extra-bright flare exploded nearby, startling the bird enough to alter its trajectory. Its wing brushed Margaret's shoulder as it passed, the force nearly knocking her down, but she maintained her footing and pushed forward. And then they were there crashing through the underbrush into the waiting arms of the rescue team. Tom immediately threw a protective tarp over them both as Jason moved in to check Shadow's injuries. "That," Sheriff Pritchard said, breathing heavily from the climb and the tension, "was the craziest damn rescue I've ever seen." Margaret looked up at him, rain dripping from her silver hair, a grin spreading across her face despite her exhaustion. "Welcome to Mountain Valley Rescue, Sheriff." Margaret lunged forward, the sheriff barely catching her before she could follow the dog over the edge. "He's gone, Margaret," Sheriff Pritchard said grimly. "Nobody could survive that fall," but Margaret's eyes narrowed as she stared down into the mist. "There's a smaller ledge 30 feet down. He might have landed there." She turned to her team, determination etched in every line of her face. "Jason, prep the medical kit for canine trauma. Tom, secure that second anchor point. We're not giving up." What had driven her then, that absolute refusal to abandon Shadow despite the danger, was the same force that now united Mountain Valley against Apex Development's threats. The same determination that had led her up the cliff face through wind and rain to rescue one dog had become a community's determination to protect their home. The battle was far from over. Apex had resources and connections that a small mountain town couldn't match. There would be more challenges, more attempts to divide and intimidate them. But something fundamental had changed. In the weeks that followed, Richard's shed was rebuilt by volunteers from across the community, larger and sturdier than before. His military mementos couldn't be replaced, but neighbors brought photographs they had of Richard at community events over the years, creating a new album of memories. Shadow's leg healed completely, the only reminder of his ordeal a slight favoring of that limb when he was tired. He became something of a local celebrity, welcomed in every shop in town and receiving treats wherever he went. The documentation effort continued, expanding to include research into Apex's projects in other communities and establishing connections with environmental groups across the state. What had begun as a defense of one property had grown into a model for how small communities could protect themselves from predatory development. Margaret still led Mountain Valley Rescue, though she had begun training Jason to eventually take over more of the high-angle rescues, not because age had diminished her abilities, but because she recognized the value of passing on knowledge while she was still active to guide and advise. The final resolution of the conflict with Apex came not through a dramatic confrontation, but through the steady pressure of legal challenges, regulatory oversight, and community solidarity. Faced with mounting investigations and the prospect of lengthy, expensive legal battles, Apex eventually announced they were reconsidering the scope of their Mountain Valley project. 6 months after Shadow's rescue, Margaret sat on her porch with Richard and Dale watching Shadow and a new puppy Richard had adopted playing in the yard. The fall colors painted the surrounding mountains in brilliant hues of red and gold, a reminder of nature's enduring cycles of renewal. Apex submitted revised development plans yesterday, Dale informed them, sipping the coffee Margaret had provided. Scaled back to just the resort area with guaranteed public access to timber, lake, and conservation easements on the surrounding forest land. Richard raised an eyebrow. "They're actually compromising?" Dale nodded. "Their legal troubles in Colorado caught up with them. Board of Directors decided cutting losses here was better than another public relations disaster." Margaret watched Shadow guiding the enthusiastic puppy with the patience of an experienced elder, teaching, protecting, showing the way. "Sometimes standing your ground is enough," she observed. "You don't always have to defeat an enemy. Sometimes you just have to show them you won't be defeated." The conversation turned to other matters, the upcoming fall festival, plans for winter rescue training, Richard's physical therapy progress. The threat hadn't disappeared entirely, but it had receded enough to allow life to regain its normal rhythms. Later, after Richard and Dale had left, Margaret took Shadow for a short walk along the forest path behind her cabin. The German shepherd moved easily now, His recovery complete in body, though Margaret suspected the experience had changed him, just as it had changed all of them. They paused at a clearing that offered a view of Eagle Cliff in the distance. Shadow sat beside Margaret, both of them gazing at the sheer rock face where their paths had first crossed. "You know something, Shadow?" Margaret said, the dog's ears perking up at her voice. "Every rescue teaches us something if we're paying attention. Yours taught me that some things are worth fighting for no matter the odds." Shadow leaned against her leg, a gesture of canine agreement or simply affection. It hardly mattered which. The connection was real either way, a bond forged in crisis and strengthened through shared purpose. As they turned to head home, Margaret caught sight of a golden eagle soaring high above the cliff, its wingspan magnificent against the evening sky. Not a threat now, but a reminder of wild things protecting what was theirs, of the natural balance that had existed long before human developments and would continue long after. "Come on, boy," she said to Shadow. "Let's go home." And together they walked back toward the lights of her cabin, visible now through the trees as darkness settled over mountain valley, the community they had helped save, one rescue at a time. Thank you for listening. If this story touched you, please subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments.